You're listening to Decolonization, a podcast series that explores how Ukraine and Eastern Europe are perceived globally, and why countering Russian imperial influence is crucial for the future of global democracy. The podcast is created by Ukraine.Ukraїner International, and I'm your host, Anastasiia Marushevska. Our guest today is Taras Kuzio. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science at National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. His previous positions were at the University of Alberta, George Washington University, University of Toronto, and many others. He is an author and editor of 24 books, including Russian Disinformation and Western Scholarship and Fascism and Genocide, Russia's War Against Ukrainians. Yeah, maybe we can start by you giving a little bit of context about your work and why you actually decided to focus on Russian disinformation in Western academia, because in general you cover many other important topics, but maybe you can provide us a little bit of context of your focus here.
Well, it's probably the origins of this lie in the fact that I grew up in Great Britain, and within the academic world in Great Britain, probably true also in the United States, especially in Germany, the field of, shall we say, Russian or Eurasian or post-communist studies has always been heavily dominated by people who are experts on Russia. Now, this is the only region of the world where one group of experts thinks or claims to be an expert on the entire region. I mean, for example, if you're an expert on Brazil, you cannot say you're an expert on Latin America and Central America. If you're an expert on Russia, for some reason you think you have a right, or you are clever enough to talk about events in Tajikistan, in Azerbaijan, in Ukraine, in Estonia. So it's a kind of a legacy from the Soviet Union. Of course, this means that most of these Russian experts have no real knowledge of these other countries, but they often do think they do, and they write about these other areas, especially now with the Ukrainian-Russian war. They also are usually the people usually invited to podcasts and to TV and radio interviews are usually Russian experts, not Ukrainian or Estonian or Azerbaijani or other experts. And that also kind of influences this. I think you also have to take into account that many academics are quite lazy. For example, you don't have to be in Ukraine or Russia today to write about those countries necessarily. Fieldwork is, of course, very important. But a lot of things are online, so you can be sitting in Washington or Berlin or London and accessing various materials. Nevertheless, what I call academic orientalism continues to exist, whereby quite a few Russianists continue to use only sources from Russia when writing about Ukraine. So they're too lazy to even go to Ukrainian websites where they can find materials in Russian. And even if it's in Ukrainian, you can use Google Translate. You know, it's not that difficult to do. So you'll have a lot of books where, Putin is cited, huge numbers, but, Poroshenko and Zelensky are never cited. Ukrainian sources are never cited. Kremlin sources are always cited. So I call this academic orientalism. It's looking at Ukraine through the eyes of Moscow. This also is impacted in journalism because we have a continuation, as we had in the Soviet Union, that most journalists who cover the former Soviet Union are based in Moscow. And so they visit these other countries like Ukraine only occasionally, like during an election or something. And so again, they're impacted by the fact who they talk to in Moscow, who their friends are, who are their colleagues, who they read. They tend to use a lot of, Russian materials. So all of this impacts upon the way Ukraine has been perceived. And one of the examples of how this was impacted upon, which I think was worse in 2014 than it is today, after 2022, is that the majority of Western academics adopted the Kremlin line on Ukraine. They adopted the line that this was a civil war in Ukraine. This was the view of the majority of Western academics. It was a view of the probably most policymakers, especially in Germany and France. And this was a reflection of this Russophilism, which is very deeply ingrained, this kind of looking at Ukraine through the eyes of Moscow, this academic orientalism, and also I would say a fixation, an obsession with looking at Ukraine as a regionally divided, linguistically divided, very weak country. So, if in Russia, Russian nationalists talk about Ukraine as a kind of artificial construct, a non-existent real estate, divided between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. In the West, this same construct existed amongst academics, but they would never call it an artificial state, but they would still talk about it as a weak country, as a regionally divided country. And in fact, the highest number of articles published in the last 30 years about Ukraine have always dealt with this linguistic, regional conflicts. How does this impact upon policymaking? Well, it meant that in 2022, majority of Western academics, experts at think tanks and policymakers really did believe, like in Moscow, that Ukraine would be quickly defeated. There's a long track record of Western academics and policymakers and think tank experts of getting Ukraine wrong, which they still, by the way, continue to do. So that's the kind of background. My academic work, MA level and PhD level in Britain was in this environment of Russophilism, which is better today than it used to be in the Cold War, but nevertheless, it still exists, especially in the writing of Russian history. I mean, that is another separate question, but Ukraine is a kind of, a country which is not seen as real, not seen as kind of authentic, shall we say. And that view, is quite deep amongst many of these. So they can't really explain why Ukraine is so resilient, why Ukraine is putting up this great resistance against Russia. It doesn't fit their narrative of this weakly divided country.
Yeah, of course. Later, I wanted to ask you about some specific people that I found in your research fascinating, because I stumble upon them as well. And it doesn't end up, what they're saying to the reality. And I wanted to, before we jump to some specific examples from your research, and what do you believe is the role of academia during the time of this hybrid warfare? Like, sometimes it feels like academia is detached from everyday life of citizens, but in reality, it shapes the media and public opinion. And can you delve a little bit on it? How does it work, and why, as you mentioned already, academia, think tanks, and policymakers are kind of connected and influence each other? Maybe you can give some kind of examples or explanation on how it works.
Well, I mean, if you compare political science to, and in political science I also include international relations, if you compare that field to history, well, they are less ivory tower, kind of isolated from the world, than historians. Historians, I would say, are far more ivory tower academics than political science and international affairs scholars. I mean, they have to deal with the world as it exists today. They write op-eds in newspapers, articles for specialist publications. They are invited to TV and radio, and podcasts and this kind of thing. So they're more in tune with what's going on. Nevertheless, they tend to bring their biases to their fields. And, as I say, one of the ways that the biases come in is, kind of looking at Ukraine through the eyes of Moscow, also which sources you use, which people you talk to. All of that influences how you look upon this. I think there's a very strong perception amongst quite a few academics that, especially historians, but some political scientists working on Russia, that Ukraine doesn't really belong in Europe. You know, it's a kind of, it should be with Russia. It's kind of Russian to some degree. Then that still, I think, is quite influential as well. So I think all of these factors are there. You sometimes have ideological factors. So some particular academics, like, for example, British Richard Sakwa, and others in the United States, they would, because they are quite extreme left wing, they also have this anti-American, pro-Russian approach to the field as well. Because usually, politicians on the extreme left in Britain, the former leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, their anti-Americanism makes them pro-Russian, and that's true also of some academics. But I think the fixation, it's a kind of, what is really strange is their selective use of sources. It's as though they write the conclusion first, and then they collect the sources which fit the conclusion. And so you can, if I review a lot of articles for academic journals, I can straight away see when an article has been written in this way, where the conclusion is written first and then the sources are collected to fit this. This happens relatively a lot. One example is a book that only came out in 2023 by Driscoll and Dominic Carrel, on describing the conflict in Ukraine after 2014 as a civil war. This is really surprising because it's so late in the publications, as it were. 2023 is already after the full-scale invasion. And it's surprising because Dominic Carrel is the chair of Ukrainian studies in Ottawa. At the same time, it's not surprising because Dominic Carrel has been writing and exaggerating the language question in Ukraine for 30 years. He's from Quebec, and so the influence of Quebec and the language question in Canada has impacts upon his approach. But it also, you can see straight away in my review of his book, which was very critical, showed this, the lack of field work. What you have today, is you had it in 2014, but especially 2022, is that everybody wants to be an expert on this war, in social media and in books and stuff. So a huge number of books are published. Probably 3/4 of them are nothing special. They don't add anything to the quality of the literature. But everybody wants to jump on this topic because it's a sexy topic. You can maybe get grants. You can get yourself publicized by writing about this. But they don't use Ukrainian sources. They, of course, never travel to Ukraine, even prior to 2022. I think very few of them do any field work. Arel and Driscoll didn't do any field work for their book. When I wrote my first book on this conflict published in 2017, Putin's War Against Ukraine, I spent practically a year going back and forth, traveling throughout the south and east of Ukraine, visiting towns, talking to volunteers, talking to veterans and others like. And I got an understanding of how Russian speakers in Ukraine, the majority of them are pro-Ukrainian. You only can understand that if you do the fieldwork, if you visit the country. And sadly, you have a lot of these publications where academics just simply don't do the fieldwork and they don't use Ukrainian sources. And therefore they do, as you said, live in this echo chamber. And so, but sadly, they have still continued influence because often they're the ones, still invited to write op-eds and to TV and radio. One example in Britain is Mark Galeotti. Yes, he's anti-Putin, but his writings are so pro-Russian, they undermine the Ukrainian argument. And so I would call it soft Putinism in that sense. And he has an op-ed in the Sunday Times because he's a well-known Russianist on the military. He's expert on the Russian military. He's invited to TV and radio. And that sadly is what we're, facing. And it's partly, I would say, the fault of the Ukrainian diaspora. I lived 15 years in Toronto, and Ukrainian diaspora doesn't do contemporary Ukrainian studies. Ukrainian diaspora in North America, where you have all these academic centers, they still focus on the Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor, and Ukrainian history. They don't do any real research and publishing on the contemporary period. So we're not even trying to take on these Russianists in many ways. And I often therefore feel I'm doing this alone.
Yeah, this is very interesting. And for me, I have this question here. Yeah, it might sound naive, I don't know. But in your book, Crisis in Russian Studies, the one that you published before the full-scale war, where there's a lot of analysis of academic work about the Maidan revolution and about the war in the East and occupation of Crimea. Like, you mentioned that some of these so-called pro-Russian or softly pro-Putin academics, they sometimes use non-existing sources or, of course, exclusively Russian. And I can understand that they can go and speak their opinion, they have freedom to do it. But when it comes to academic work, that needs to go through peer reviews and things like this, how do they manage to publish things which are just incompetent? How is it possible?
Well, this is a very good question. And partly it's selective use of sources. So for example, there's simply no excuse when writing about Ukraine today to not have abundant sources. There are very good sociological structures in Ukraine. I know at least 4 or 5 of them that produce fantastic surveys. They have been doing since 2014 and earlier, where you can look at how Russian military aggression impacts Ukrainian national identity and Russian-Ukrainian relations. These are often ignored by these Western academics, even though they're all online. I think that the peer review process is something that is it's very badly organized. So you will have today quite a few journals, and I've experienced this myself, which when you submit your draft article for review, the journal actually asks you, do you want any particular reviewers to look at this? And which reviewers do you not want? So that already undermines the review process, because basically you're creating an echo chamber. You're creating, you're asking this, shall we say, pro-Russian author, which other authors agree with you that would you like them to review your article? And so, these articles therefore get through, this so-called peer review process because they're reviewed by people who agree with the author. And one article which was just published in the well-known journal Nationalities Papers is an example of that. I wrote a very long review of it in Twitter about a week ago. It's by Per Rudling, an academic from Sweden. He has an obsession with the Ukrainian diaspora. The article is so biased, so badly written, and yet it managed to be published by the journal Nationalities Papers. And I wanted to ask the editor, how did this get through the peer review process? And it probably got through because the author, Per Rudling, suggested which reviewers would look at his paper. So the actual review process is very flawed. This is also true of book publishers as well. I mean, how did Driscoll and Arell's book get published in 2023 by Cambridge University Press when it's been reviewed very badly already, and it's going to be reviewed badly by many other people? I mean, book is already in 2023 out of date because it's after the full-scale invasion, and it's simply, it's really badly sourced and written. The authors did no field work. They selective use of publications. So I think this problem of peer review is just simply very badly flawed throughout the academic world, which leads to this publications being released because they are reviewed in an echo chamber.
Yeah, that's very infuriating, and
it is. Of course it is. Yes, it is. Yes.
I was one of the so-called experts you mentioned. You don't focus on him that much, but you mentioned him. It's Samuel Sharap, because I had a situation where we needed to refuse collaboration with someone who worked with Sharap because, it was weird for me to, when they explained that, okay, Samuel Sharap, he just have a different point of view. But just for context, for the listeners and everyone who will listen to the podcast. So Samuel Sharap, he, quite subtly sharing Russian narratives. So he's not openly pro-Putin or anything like this, but through sharing these narratives, he was wrong on every issue. He was wrong. He was saying that before the full-scale invasion, he was saying that no way America should give weapons to Ukraine because Ukraine will fall in a few days and things like this. And he continues this line of sentiments, jumping, back and forth a little bit. And he's a senior researcher at one of the most influential think tanks, RAND. And you cannot really, again, limit his freedom of speech when he goes and says things he wants. But again, RAND is working directly with policymakers and influencing and kind of sharing their research. Do you experience, how do you work with this kind of research and these kind of researchers? They're not even marginalized. So it's very hard to separate them from the, the whole, hundreds and thousands of people obsessed about Ukraine, How do you counter this? As, for example, Ukrainian media, as Ukrainer, how can we counter this kind of research?
Well, I mean, you're right to ask the latter part of that question, because both Ukraine as a country, as a government, as the presidential administration and the Ukrainian diaspora simply do not counter this kind of disinformation. It is surprising, for example, why the Ukrainian government has not approached various experts and academics in the West, like, for example, Adrian Karatnitsky, who's based in New York, who writes excellent materials, and ask them, can you write counter proposals to people like Charap? The problem is deeper with people like Charap, and it's not just him. It's that, and I recommend listeners looking at a paper which is available on the website of the Washington think tank CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies, which was published recently, which analyzed how American think tank experts and academics got the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 completely wrong. I've written about this as well, but this is a very long study. It's well worth looking at. And you're right, Samuel Charap has gotten everything wrong. That's what's surprising. His views can be whatever they want, but what's surprising is Rand Corporation continues to employ people who always get things wrong. And Charap is one of those. But it's not just Charap. The most invited person on podcasts dealing with the Ukraine-Russia war is Michael Kaufman. He got everything wrong as well, prior to the full-scale invasion. He also said that all of these American think tank experts, there's a kind of a word for them in Washington. They call Beltway bandits, because the Beltway is the ring road around Washington, and these are Beltway bandits who just are always seeking grants from the US government, like the Rand Corporation. But they all got it wrong because they all believed the mythology that the Russian army is the second best in the world. And therefore they were, Michael Kaufman had an article in Foreign Affairs 3 days before the full-scale invasion saying Ukraine's had it. The Russians are just going to walk in and just, defeat Ukraine very quickly. And yet he's still the most invited person on podcasts to be talking about it. Nobody, podcasts are lovely. I listen to a lot of them, but they're often too gentlemanly. Nobody asks tough questions on podcasts. Nobody's ever asked Kaufman or Charap on a podcast, why did you get it wrong? Because you don't do that kind of thing. It's not gentlemanly. And so of course they get away with it. They all got it wrong because they believed the hype about the Russian army. What to me is the most surprising is that if Russia is a mafia state, as US diplomatic cables have been saying since 2010, you can find it online, WikiLeaks cable from 2010, a US diplomatic cable from Madrid, which describes Russia as a mafia state. So Russia's been a mafia state for 15 years. If it's a mafia state, that means everything is corrupted in Russia, including the military. Why did these experts not realize that? Why did they make the army an exception to that mafia state? Of course, if it's a mafia state, that means, the Russian military, the Russian security services, everything is totally corrupted, which of course is good for Ukraine. But it means that this is not the second best army in the world. It's the second best army in Ukraine. So Charap is similar. He's more dangerous than Kaufman because Kaufman has become pro-Ukrainian since the full-scale invasion. But Charap approaches Ukraine with this arrogant kind of realism that Ukraine.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, basically that Charap would love it. What Putin wants. What does Putin want? Putin wants a second Yalta. He wants to sit down with Trump and to carve up spheres of influence between the United States and Russia, just as they did in 1945. That's what Putin really wants. And Charap is happy with that. And he doesn't really care what Ukrainians think. I think there's a final thing I'll just say on this is how American academics and think tankers do not understand nationalism. Maybe that's more a thing we understand in Europe. All of these so-called experts never saw the rise of Donald Trump and populist nationalism in the United States. And so in a very large book published by the Rand Corporation just a few months before the full-scale invasion, which was led by Charap, they, for example, write that ideology and nationalism are not driving factors for the Russian military and Russian foreign policy. Totally wrong.
Yeah,
this is what they're saying. And you're right. This is what they're telling the Pentagon because the Rand Corporation gets a lot of money from the Pentagon. So they get all of this wrong. To me, what's surprising is how they can stay in their positions when they get everything wrong all the time.
Yeah, this is complete incompetence. And, it's,
yes.
What I find, like you mentioned already, this British academic, Richard Sakwa, who was just sharing these absurd narratives about Ukraine. And the other one is John Mearsheimer, which he's also obsessed with Ukraine. He goes, I saw him speaking at some pro-Russian Indian channels, so completely crazy. And he's also a notorious anti-Semite, which is also very interesting. He likes to spread different conspiracy theories and this Israel lobby that he published. And but what is peculiar with him, that he actually confirmed himself that he received money from the Kremlin-affiliated Waldai Discussion Club for his books to be published. And it's not always possible to track whether these so-called experts actually connected directly, with money to Russia. But what is your feeling of this? Is this just more of a useful idiots for Russia, or it's a very well-organized structure of Russia to influence academia by giving grants, by establishing some kind of clubs and media and things like this?
Well, you're right to bring this up because I think there is a lot of Russian money being thrown around in the West for a long period of time. Often it's impossible to trace this money, but I think you can usually separate the useful idiots from the paid agents. I would not call Mearsheimer the same as Sakwa. Mearsheimer is right wing, so he's more closer to the kind of Charap world of realism, I would say. But, he's a contradiction already. I mean, listeners can find his article from 1993 in Foreign Affairs, where he argued in favor of Ukraine keeping hold of its nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so you can find Tucker Carlson being actually...
Well, he's a contradiction, obviously, and maybe he's gotten more money recently. Yeah. I mean, Western academics and think tankers who continue to go to Valdai after 2014 have to be suspicious. And that's certainly the case. I think the Sakwas of this world, he's more similar to Anatol Lieven, a horrible British Russophile who works at the only really pro-Russian think tank in Washington. And he, and Anatol Lieven and Sakwa have been promoting a kind of a pro-Russian agenda for the last 20, 30 years. They lean more towards, I would say, not useful idiot, but more towards, kind of closeness to Russia and even receiving financial support from Russia. The Anatol Lieven the Quincy Institute in Washington, and Sakwa an academic. They are, I would say, more of that kind of extreme left, anti-American, pro-Russian tendency. Mearsheimer and Charap tend to be more that realist school. Yeah. I think that today it's more difficult for them than it was in 2014. Then and I wrote a lot about the 2014 Russophilism in that book, as you say, Crisis in Russian Studies, which is available free to download. It's already been downloaded, like 20,000 copies. Yeah. But today they have to be more cautious, these Russophiles, because of course Russia is committing massive war crimes. I mean, the Ukrainian prosecutor's office has collected 140,000 examples of war crimes. So today, if you're a Russophile, you have to camouflage yourself, which you didn't have to do in 2014. Today, you have to camouflage yourself by saying, I want peace. I hate bloodshed. And let's have peace. And by peace, what they mean is that Ukraine compromises. Not Russia, Ukraine compromises. Ukraine gives up territory, Ukraine gives up people, Ukraine basically says it's defeated. That's what they understand by peace and getting rid of bloodshed, but that's their way of camouflaging themselves by being pro-Russian today. And I think that Charap's influence, I think this last thing I would say, probably impacted upon the Biden administration in that, and there's evidence of him being asked to come and talk to the people in the Biden administration. In the Biden administration's main criticism, I would say, of them is the drip supply of weapons to Ukraine. The Biden administration is guilty of allowing the war in Ukraine to become a forever war. This war could have ended in 2023, but the Biden administration was so afraid of Russian nuclear weapons, of escalation, of the collapse of the Soviet Union, in sort of collapse of Russia, similar to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that they were afraid of giving Ukraine all the weapons it needed and straight away. So they kept drip supplying it over a long period of time. This led to the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in June 23. So that Charap kind of obsession with what Russia thinks, what Russia will do, whether Russia will resort to nuclear weapons, impacted on the Biden administration, and it leading to missing the opportunity which was there. In late 2022, Ukraine could have defeated Russia. At that moment, there were only 170,000 Russian troops in Ukraine. There were no fortifications. These so-called Surovikin lines were not yet built. Ukraine had just completely defeated Russian forces in Kharkiv. It was about to defeat Russian forces in Kherson. If that moment, sort of September, October, November, the United States had given Ukraine everything it could have given, which it gave later, like missiles, tanks, jets, and everything. Ukrainian forces would have reached the Black Sea coast. They would have defeated those Russian forces, but they were too paranoid about this escalation fear, which is propounded by people like Mearsheimer and Charap.
Yeah, this is very well explained. This is connection of actually Russia-centered academia and how it influenced not just the domain of ideas, but actually directly what's going on front lines as well. And that's why I always considered that this hybrid warfare in the West is not perceived as a crucial one, and for so long has been dismissed, and this kind of when we talk about specific people, what I find fascinating, we already talked about Charab being, senior researcher at RAND, and Sakwa continues to be a professor at Kent University, and Mearsheimer at University of Chicago. And it again, rise a question whether academia in the West building up some new security measures to understand their role in all of this process. I'm not talking here again by just not allowing someone to speak, but more considering it from the perspective of national security rather than just, some crazy academics are talking about something, Do you think it's possible to get to that realization that academia is a part of this, hybrid warfare?
That's a difficult question to answer. Certainly what we are experiencing now is that Russia has literally, well, not just Russia, but Ukraine as well to some degree in this war, but everything is now weaponized. I mean, literally everything. And Russia is doing that in the West against Western interests. Russia, for example, has a strong influence in the Russian diaspora in the United States. I mean, the Russian diaspora in the United States has been investigated by the FBI because of many agents that came out. Nearly 1 million Russians fled Russia after the mobilization in September, October of 22. And apparently a lot of those are now agents in the West. So Russia has weaponized many different components of life in the West, which inevitably is going to impact upon academic work, think tank work, and such like. I think we and many now institutions are more cautious in taking money from Russia. I think that is now more taboo, shall we say. There are now fewer academic exchanges. And so that has changed in 2022. It didn't change in 2014, but it changed in 2022. So I think Russian academic think tank world is more cut off from the West today. And that's very good because most Russian academics and think tankers support the genocidal war against Ukraine. I mean, this is reality. This is a fact. Some of them continue to publish in the West, but the Karaganovs and others of this world are all mouthpieces for the Kremlin today. And so Russian academics are not rebelling against the Russian war against Ukraine. They are supporting it. And we should understand that. In the West, I think it's impossible to change the minds of people like Levin, Mearsheimer, Charap, and Sakwa. I mean, they're always going to propound their views. It seems that people don't lose their jobs when they're wrong or when they have these positions. But we have to realize that they are very, very prolific. I mean, Sakwa publishes books every 1 or 2 years. He publishes books. Even though they get through review process. I mean, his first book on the war in Ukraine was published in 2015. I reviewed it. He didn't use the only Ukrainian source he used for writing about the war was the Kiev Post.
Yeah. If understanding a little bit, the context of Ukraine and what actually happened to Kiev Post when,
I know, but I mean, it's like if I was a professor and a MA student or a PhD student submitted a paper to me where the only source was Kiev Post, I would give them a failure, an F. It's simply bad writing. Where are your primary sources? But there are no primary sources. So, sadly, I think that will continue. I think today they are more camouflage, as I've said. I don't think that they are going to change their viewpoints. I think where there has to be change is that the Ukrainian government and embassies abroad and the Ukrainian diaspora in North America need to realize that they should be more proactive. And they are not. They're not. They should be attending conferences. They should be challenging these academics. They should be creating their own panels at these conferences, writing, encouraging people like me to write articles for Foreign Affairs and others. But they are not. So we Ukrainians sadly often complain a lot, but they don't get involved enough in being proactive against these pro-Russianists. And that, I think, is surprising with Zelensky because he's so good at PR, but they don't really understand how the things we're talking about today. I don't think Zelensky and his team understand how the Western world works in terms of, influencing policymakers and academics and think tankers.
I had many similar conversations. That is, I think Ukraine's problem here that we do some kind of ad hoc solutions for different things, but we don't have this institutional approach, especially when it comes to academia or media. But, just a little bit, to continue your thought that you said that Russian money is a little bit more taboo since 2022. But, I was speaking at Oxford University this December, and students told me a story that there is Pakistan is financing events by where they invite Russian experts. And so the level of of penetration of this is very big. Ukraine representation there is comparably really, really small. And
yeah. I mean the quite a few countries in London, in Washington, their embassies provide various financial grants to think tanks to prepare papers. I mean, this is quite common. It is in the United States. You can get away with this because it doesn't fall under this very tough law called the Foreign Agent Registration Act that doesn't apply to think tanks. So governments do that, and they do that in London. The Kazakhstan embassy just published a paper with the Henry Jackson Society, for example, a think tank, a right-wing think tank in London. But yeah, I mean, Russia will try to get round these various bans, by providing money through other countries, through other potential sources. I think where we should kind of talk though, which is I think the more controversial area, is the whole question of what to do with, when we're talking about decolonization, is what to do with Russian literature and culture. And in Ukraine, what you've had since 2022 is a process of de-Russification of the country, which didn't really happen after 2014. After 2014, you had decommunization, the adoption of 4 laws in 2015. By the way, these were strongly condemned by many academics in the West, these laws.
Banning Russian language, persecuting Russian speaking and things like that.
Yeah, all of this rubbish. And when they didn't look at any opinion polls which showed this was never true, most Ukrainians, only like 3% of Ukrainians ever saw any kind of problems with the Russian language. But since 2022, you've had, this, for some people in the West, controversial question of de-Russification. That is, for example, removing statues of Pushkin, of Tolstoy and others. And this is something I think many academics Russophiles in the West find very difficult to look at, because they don't see these writers as not just writers, but also as supporters of Russian imperialism and Russian colonialism. This was always the case. I mean, British writers in the 19th century supported British colonialism. It's nothing unusual here. And these Russian writers also, look at Pushkin's views on Hetman Mazepa. So that I think is becoming the new area of controversy, and they don't seem to want to put this into context, that the reason this is happening, they have to ask themselves, why did the statue to Tsarina Catherine, get removed now from Odessa, but not after 2014? It's because Russian military aggression is so severe, and, Russia is trying to commit genocide, that even Russian speakers in Odessa have now become anti-Russian. So it's Russia's fault here. It's not Ukraine's fault or NATO's fault that this is happening. So I think this is a new area of contention, and it's happening, because, and this is shown in opinion polls in Ukraine, that Russian military aggression, especially since 2022, has pushed eastern and southern Ukrainians who previously or prior to 2014 had a pro-Russian view on language and culture. Now they are more closer to Western and Central Ukrainians in their attitudes to Russia and the Russian people. There's a very good opinion poll by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology from late November on Ukraine attitudes to Russia, which shows that less than 5% of Ukrainians today now have a positive view of the Russian people. This is how much has changed inside Ukraine in terms of identity. I think many of these Western Russophiles, academics and such like, can't get their heads around this. They simply can't appreciate to what degree this Russian military aggression, 2014, especially 2022, has changed Ukrainian-Russian relations forever. And this is why I think it's time for Western academic centers to move Ukrainian studies from Eurasian or post-Soviet departments to European departments, because Ukrainians and Russians are now divided, separated for decades. You cannot go back. It's too late now. And so this is where I think is now the new controversies in terms of decolonization. Decolonization is basically de-Russification. I mean, this is.
Yeah, but you just mentioned, for example, many British writers in 19th century supported imperialism, and I know now if we talk about Kipling or something, we still can study him, we still can talk about him, we still can read him, but we do understand the context of it. But why it's so hard for the scholars to accept that Russia is an empire, that it's not nation state. And when you study empire, you need to take it into account that is not consist of one nation that constitutes state. Because I believe that this is one of the biggest problems, because Russian studies study Russia as a country somehow. Not all of these, as Ukraine used to be occupied by Russian Empire, or Georgia, or places like this. Why? Maybe there is some kind of historical background that you can give of why this was ignored. The imperialism of Russia.
Well, it's again a good question. I think the problem is there has been too little comparative studies of, shall we say, the Soviet Union as an empire, Russia as an empire compared to Western empires. Alexander Motyl has done this. But I mean, there are very few books about this, and you're right that this has led to this misperception that somehow the Soviet Union was not really an empire, that these non-Russian republics were not really colonies, Well, and the argument is usually made, well, Brezhnev came from Ukraine. Yes, he was an ethnic Russian from Dnipropetrovsk.
Well,
so
came
what?
from India, yeah.
Yeah. But it doesn't really matter, because in every empire, those imperialists always hired local people to help them in policing the empire. And there's no way the small British army in India could rule India without the help of Indian troops. And that was true in Africa and elsewhere. You had always large numbers of local collaborators working for the imperialists. And so how is that different in the Soviet Union when these various people would also work for the Soviet Communist Party, and they were just simply typically collaborators? I mean, I don't think we should see that as unusual. I think where you have the problem is that academics are conservative. And I mean, with a small c. They don't like to change. And the biggest example of this is historians in the West who write about Russia. They haven't really changed their approach since 1991. The USSR hasn't been around for 30 years, but they continue to write histories of Russia as though nothing's changed. And those histories of Russia tend to be written using 19th century imperial nationalist frameworks. The first chapter of that book, Crisis in Russian Studies, surveys these Western histories, and it looks at how these Western histories have adopted the same basic approach to Russian history that Putin and the Kremlin does. This so-called 1,000 years of Russian history. Putin and the Kremlin and Western historians of Russia both talk about Kiev and Russia, then Vladimir Suzdal, Muscovy, Russian Empire, Soviet Union, Russian Federation. That both sides do. This is completely wrong. It ignores Ukraine. It ignores the fact that usually when you write a history of a territory, that belongs to that country. So the history of Britain is the history of everything that's happened on the territory of Britain. So the history of Ukraine begins in Kiev Rus. Kiev Rus is mainly inside the territory of contemporary Ukraine. It also ignores Ukrainian approach to history. I mean, which is that Ukrainians and Russians have separate histories. But Western historians of Russia, like in the Kremlin, approach this history as though it's an Eastern Slavic or Pan-Russian, Obshe-Ruski history, where the Ukrainians are always somehow linked to the Russians. And hence they find it difficult to see Ukrainians and Russians as separate from each other. And this very deep influence of Western histories of Russia has been there for a long period of time. When Leonid Kravchuk was president back in 1992, he visited Germany, and they said, well, we can give you an interpreter, but we only have Russian. He says, I only speak Ukrainian, I don't speak Russian. And they said to him, why? Ukraine is like Bavaria in Germany. They compared Ukraine to Russia like Bavaria to the rest of Germany. This was the kind of very typical Western view of Ukraine. It's a kind of an appendage of Russia. And the influence of this is the Western approach to history of Russia. There is still today not a single Western history of Russia which is a history of the Russian nation state. All the histories of Russia are histories of the Russian Empire. Usually when you have a history of, say, France, of Britain, of Germany, it's a history of the nation state, which emerged in the 19th or whatever century. There is no history of the Russian Federation. All the histories of Russia are of the empire, and that's a problem. Why are Western historians of Russia promoting an imperialist view of Russian history? Why are they not trying to develop a post-imperial civic national identity for the Russian people? So that I think is a major influence on how this region was perceived. To give you one final example, Ukrainian diplomats would always complain that in Brussels Ukrainian was always regarded as an appendage of Russia. So when Ukraine said we would like to join the EU reply was, well, no, we can't invite you because then we have to invite Russia. And Ukraine would say, what's it got to do with us, what you do with Russia? This view that Ukraine was an appendage of Russia only began to change after the Orange Revolution and especially Euromaidan Revolution and Russia's military aggression in 2014. So it's taken a long period of time for the West to kind of view Ukraine as different to Russia, and especially today. But Western historians of Russia basically haven't changed. I mean, they continue to promote this kind of общерусский, pan-Russian, Eastern Slavic, where Russian-Ukrainian history. In that kind of history, Ukraine has no identity.
Yeah, this is very frustrating. But, you mentioned, that there are some changes happening. Yeah, very slowly, as one of our guests, Bernard Levy, said that, West has always been late, just on everything. So, this process is very slow. But, if we talk about some positive changes, maybe especially after full-scale invasion began, what can you highlight as maybe some names or some changes within academic circles of actually recognizing Ukraine and including it into the broader context of Europe and world history, maybe?
Well, I think what has stunned Western viewers, academics, think tankers, policymakers, what has stunned them is Ukrainian resilience. I'm not surprised, you're not surprised, but they are all surprised. They all expected Ukraine to be quickly defeated. This didn't happen. They are surprised at how Ukrainians have managed to survive 3 years of this, incredibly relentless Russian military aggression and war crimes. And that, I think, is the biggest change in attitudes. That they have to, whether they like it or not, and for many it's difficult for them to really accept that this change is happening. The Ukrainians are so resilient. They have resisted. They continue to resist. There are some very good scholars. And what's interesting for me, comparing history and political science, is that history is dominated by men. Historians tend to be all men in the West, in the field of Ukraine. And I think in Ukraine probably a lot as well. But in political science, you have probably maybe more women, but certainly women are far better represented. And there are a lot of women scholars now in political science writing about Ukraine, and they're writing excellent work. Jade McClin, I recommend anything that she writes. For example, a British scholar.
Yeah, we talked to her in this podcast.
Right. Yeah, she's excellent. And one of her best books, which came out in 2023, is something we haven't really talked about, and it's worth bringing up. It's a book about how the Russian people support this war against Ukraine. And I think that's important because what's changed in Ukrainian identity now compared to 2014 is that in 2014 until 2021, Ukrainians had negative views of the Russian government and leaders, but not of the Russian people. Today, Ukrainians have negative views of both Russian people and Russian leaders. And she has a whole book devoted to this question, which shows how this is correct, that the Russian people do support this war. But that this fact is something that quite a few Western experts and journalists and academics don't want to believe. They don't want to see Russia in this bad way. And I'll give you two examples of this. Mark Galeotti and Ostrovsky, who is the Russia and East European editor of The Economist, both of them I've argued with because they they romanticize the Russian people and the Russian opposition and say, this is a war by Putin against Ukraine. It's not a war by the Russian people. They're wrong, but they can't accept it. They can't accept this reality. And so I think there are now, I read a lot and I have to try and keep up with what is being published. There's a lot of academic articles, think tank articles, books, which are being published by these very good scholars like Jade McGlynn, like Ian Garner, who's a young British scholar. I'm now preparing a joint edited volume with him on Russia as a fascist state. Again, this is another area where many Western Russianists don't want to accept. They cannot accept that Russia has become a fascist state. It's something that they don't want to go down that road because this means that Russia is beyond the pale, as it were. But so we are producing an edited collection of scholars writing about how Russia has become, we believe, a fascist dictatorship since 2020 when the constitution was changed, making Putin president for life, and especially since 2022, increased repression inside Russia and external full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So these are kind of the areas which are now, I think, the major areas of contention, but there are quite a few scholars coming up. What's interesting for me is that very few of these are scholars from Ukraine. I think political science in Ukraine is in quite a bit of a crisis. I mean, very few Ukrainian political scientists publish in the West, which is, I think, tragic. What one does, Volodymyr Kulik writes a lot in the West about national identity in Ukraine, and all of his articles are very good, but he's an exception. And most of the kind of academics in North America working in, say, Harvard or in Alberta at these Ukrainian centers are historians, so they don't write about the contemporary period. Sergei Plokhy is probably the only exception. He has an excellent book about Russian nationalism, which came out a few years ago, which I recommend. So most of these new emerging scholars, many of them women in political science, have non-Ukrainian backgrounds, and they are writing some excellent materials on memory politics, on gender, on sociology questions, on identity, on the war in Ukraine, on refugees, all of these kind of areas. So there is a major change, and I say that in comparison to 2014, Russophiles today are they have to be more cautious and more defensive. In 2014, Russophiles in the West were more aggressive. They were more assertive. Today they are less so. So that's also, I think, good.
It's less popular to be pro-Russian.
Well, they cannot defend war crimes in Ukraine. But so where they go is they say, no, this is a war by Putin, not by the Russian people.
Yeah.
Russia is not a fascist state. They want to limit the damage, as it were, of what is taking place. But they're in retreat.
But I think they also don't understand the consequences of this, because I have this example with one of the organization, not my other organization, PR Army. We work a lot with the question of deported children from occupied territories. And Almenda, Ukrainian human rights organization, they made this report about Russian universities that are implicit into indoctrination of the abducted Ukrainian children. So they basically are the ones who are taking care of these children being brainwashed in Russia and things like this. And many of these universities, they still work with Western universities. So they send the students, they send the same professors who brainwash children to work and, to receive degrees and, in the West. And this is the result of this, image that it's only Putin's war. So basically people actually responsible for some horrible crimes, they're accepted in the West because, well, they're just academics, but at the end of the day, they're not. Yeah, and
they're not.
Really, really not understood. And I think this is these consequences needs to be, highlighted more and more. That this is not about your idea of human rights and saving all the civilians in Russia and things like this. This actually has some concrete repercussions.
Well, I agree. I think that they should be named and shamed. I wonder which countries. Do you know which countries we're talking about that still invite these Russian academics?
I know that of course, the most is Global South, but in Europe, I think universities slowly start to be more cautious about it. But they need a lot of, confirmations, and this is a very long process. I know that it was Italy, I think, one of the leaders in this. I think, from what Almenda shared with us, Germany was very actually forthcoming to stop this, which was surprising, yeah. But I think it was, I don't want to be mistaken here, but I think it was something like Italy and France, the most reluctant into, changing things here. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. But I think slowly, specific universities and specific people are getting banned, in Europe, especially. I think the US is completely not interested in changing anything here. But Europe, I think, a little bit more open. So we hope that actually this perception, at least with some specific universities and specific professor, will be actually, solved, or at least publicly shamed. Yeah, as you said.
Well, I'm not surprised Germany and France. In Europe, these two countries always were the most Russophile. In academia and just generally, and Germany especially. This concept of Putin understander comes from Germany, and Ukrainian studies was always very weak in both France and Germany. It was dominated by Russophiles, and in the case of Germany, some of them were very influential, and the children of Russian nationalist emigres like RAH, R-A-H-R, a guy, a think tanker in Germany. These promoted this long-standing German kind of viewpoint that Germany and Russia should work together. It was very dominant prior to 2022 that through trade and economic links that this would help Germany influence, moderate domestic policies in Russia. Completely wrong, of course, and they supported, continues to support the building of Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline after 2014. So let's remember that in 2014, the West betrayed Ukraine. So it's not just Western academics, policymakers. The United States, Barack Obama, and British Prime Minister Cameron both ignored their commitments to Ukraine under the Budapest Memorandum. And the sanctions imposed on Russia were a joke. Western governments continued business as usual with Russia. And they also adopted the same thing as Western academics and think tankers, that this was a civil war in Ukraine and Russia wasn't really a party to the conflict. So this kind of sent a very bad and weak message to the Russian leadership. Because one of the reasons Russia got the invasion wrong in 2022, it got it wrong for two reasons. Firstly, it really believed its own mythology that Ukrainians are all little Russians waiting to be liberated. That was wrong. And secondly, it got it wrong that it believed the West would again be very weak in its response to Russia like it was in 2014. And so Russia got both of those things wrong. But it got the Western approach wrong because the West was weak after 2014 to 2021. And Germany and France were central to that because in this Normandy format Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France, Germany and France would often team up with Russia against Ukraine. Petro Poroshenko, who was Ukrainian president until 2019, always talked about this, that he was facing three countries, not just Russia there. And one of the areas we haven't talked about, but this is where it comes in, is Crimea. In 2014, what was surprising and stunning was how many Westerners, including academics, especially historians of Russia, all said, well, what's the problem with Crimea? Crimea was always Russian. And this view was very common. And in fact, the Crimea was not included in the Minsk agreements, the two Minsk agreements. And Poroshenko said that he was often told by Western leaders, forget Crimea, you've lost it forever. So that perception of Crimea is part of that Russophile tendency that existed in the West. This view that Crimea was always Russian is completely not true. Crimean history did not begin in 1783. There was 600 years prior to that of Crimean Tatar Khanate in Crimea. So it's a very racist approach to Crimean history. It denies Crimean Tatar identity. But this view was very common, and it influenced Western policymakers on this. And Germany, France were crucial there. Germany has, I think, changed to some degree since 2022. But that problem that Timothy Snyder has brought this out quite a few times. This problem that Germans look towards Russia over the heads of the people in between, over the heads of the Poles, the Ukrainians, and others. And this is something that Timothy Snyder has raised, and he's absolutely right. It's a very deep issue in the German psyche. And one does fear that the Germans, particularly like the left-wingers like Scholz, would be happy to go back to business as usual with Russia as soon as the war ends.
And it's funny because, in liberal democracies, such as most of the Western Europe, so much attention is paid to the protection of the rights of minorities and national communities, while we're talking about Crimea, they just cancel the identity of Crimean Tatars and just saying that it's all Russian, just forget about it. While Crimean Tatars have been survived genocide, survived persecution for centuries and centuries. And this is really these double standards, which are quite fascinating to explore, how they actually come to these conclusions while, saying one thing on one side and then explaining these, just forget and just go die, become Russians, forget who you are. So,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's true because the Russian policy towards Crimean Tatars in Crimea since 2014 is genocidal. Crimean Tatars have been imprisoned in huge numbers. Their culture and religion has been destroyed. It's a return to Stalinist and Brezhnevite Soviet era policies towards Crimean Tatars. I mean, sadly, Crimean Tatars don't have much presence in Western academic centers and think tanks. Nobody really writes about it. Very few people do. My colleague in Toronto wrote a very good book back in 2014. Professor Robert Magocci, he wrote a book about Crimean Tatars because he's interested in national minorities. But it's not a topic that many people cover. And you're absolutely right. The hypocrisy there, we're all in favor of multiculturalism, national minorities, but let's ignore these people. Some of it is to do with Islamophobia, and you see this with Western attitudes towards Turkey, because Turkey is a strong supporter of Crimean Tatars. There's a large Crimean Tatar emigration inside Turkey, and Turkey has strongly supported Crimea as part of Ukraine. But Western governments' relationship with Turkey are very strained, and so this also could have an impact. This is surprising because Turkey was instrumental in getting rid of the horrible regime in Syria just a month ago. and we should be thanking Turkey for doing that. Turkey did what Barack Obama didn't have the political will to do so. And this was good for Ukraine as well because it harmed Russian sphere of influence in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, Turkey, I think, is just, it's a complex partner to deal with, and for sure, Crimean Tatars has a long history of connection to Turkey. Even now, I don't know if it's the first time that Ukrainian ambassador to Turkey is a Crimean Tatar who was imprisoned in Russia for many years. So I think it's a great idea, actually, to represent Crimean Tatars on these high diplomatic positions. And I have a last question, and then I will let you go. More of a we discussed this in this podcast of actually how Ukraine and studies of Ukraine in the region in general, and including Crimean Tatars, can be integrated in broader disciplines, not just a separate, here's Ukrainian studies, but actually to speak about European history, to speak about imperialism while using Ukrainian case. Do you think it's possible, and whether we're there yet, or it's too early of a change for the academia?
Well, I think one of the Western academics working in the field of East European, Russian, post-Soviet, whatever you want to call it, Eurasian studies, have to now come to accept that the break between Ukraine and Russia is now a gulf, and relations will never be the same between both peoples and countries again. Also, they have to accept that the national identity of Ukrainians has changed revolutionary since 2014, and especially since 2022. De-Russification and movement away from the Russian language, Russian history, all of this is now happening at radical paces in Ukraine. What this means is that there needs to be a rethinking of where Ukrainian studies should be. Ukrainian studies, both history and contemporary period, should no longer be placed in departments dealing with Russia, Eurasia, former Soviet Union. It's time Ukrainian studies was moved to European studies, or East European studies, whatever. That would be, I think, a fundamentally psychological break, and it would be very important in placing Ukraine outside of Eurasia, outside of the post-Soviet world, outside of the Russian world. Ukrainians now, majority of Ukrainians now, a very high majority support EU and NATO membership. Less than 5% of Ukrainians support any kind of integration into Eurasia. So Ukraine has a membership track to join the European Union, maybe one day NATO, but certainly European Union at the moment. So I think Western academia needs to catch up with national identity in Ukraine, and with Western governments, European Union, catch up and also accept that Ukraine is now a European country. It's no longer a post-Soviet, Eurasian, semi-Russian, whatever you want to call it. That's gone. And that to me would be big proof of how academia is, and think tanks also have come to understand that changes are taking place in Ukraine, which are simply revolutionary. If one follows opinion polls as I do, the changes in Ukraine are simply revolutionary now. And that will not go back. You cannot reverse that. So it's time for these academic centers to accept that, And I think many of these Russianists find that difficult to do so, because they continue to see this area, this former Soviet space, as one space, when in fact that's no longer true. Countries, Central Asia is moving towards Chinese influence. South Caucasus is a mixed area. Azerbaijan has moved away from Eurasia, and Ukraine, Moldova, also is moving has moved into Europe. the three Baltic states have long gone. So it's time to stop looking at this former Soviet space as one entity. It's no longer exists. And I think that would be probably one of the best outcomes of this full-scale invasion and this war. It would also, show to the Ukrainians that, yes, we now see you as Europeans, no longer as some kind of post-Soviet nation.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support us at buymeacoffee.com/Ukrainier International and follow us on social media in different languages. You can find all the links in the podcast description. And thank you for listening.